Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Cord Connects. My name is Moshe Weitzberg, and I am a member of the Cord Board of Directors. On behalf of myself and Fiona Gallahue, the Secretary-Treasurer of Cord, I would like to welcome you to Cord Connects. Our session today is on the 6 competencies of wellness. I would like to introduce our wonderful speakers for today. Dr. Megan Fix is an academic emergency physician and the mother of 3 boys and a wife who lives in the mountains in Utah, where currently there is a lot of snow. She is the Director of Education for the Division of Emergency Medicine at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. She also holds numerous roles in the University of Utah Medical School, including a core faculty member for clinical methods curriculum, course director for the 4th year transition to internship course, and is the faculty director of mentoring. She is a former chair of the Cord Academic Assembly and the current co-chair for the Cord Education Committee. Her journey includes a personal commitment to well-being that started in residency, but carries through to her current life in medicine and at home. Dr. Lois Swisher is a recovering nocturnist, having worked nights for 2 decades until the first of this year, working at Mercy Philadelphia Hospital, associated with the Drexel University College of Medicine Emergency Medicine Residency. She is the vice chair of Cord's Resilience Committee with a special interest in physician suicide prevention. She wants you to know that if it takes a village to raise a child or a wellness leader, Cord is her village. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Fix and Dr. Swisher.
Thank you, Moshe.
Thank you, Moshe. And I am going to turn off my video so that we can get started. All right, everybody. Well, as Moshe mentioned, my name is Megan Fix, and we are going to talk about one of Lois and my favorite topics, faculty wellness and resilience. And so, first of all, as the title suggests, this is Cord Connects, and we really love this title because it's a point of our whole session. For the next 45 minutes, our plan is to try and connect with you, members of Cord, because we feel very strongly that connection leads to well-being. We think well-being is super important, but it has to be in conjunction with connection with others. So thank you, Cord, for making Cord Connects, because we would love to do this with all of you. Along those lines, I want to just put out there that Lois and I also really enjoy talking about wellness and resilience with individuals. So if any of what we're saying speaks to you, please feel free to get in touch with either of us, because we would love to chat with you on the phone further about these topics or try to be a support to any of you at any time. So getting into the meat, just by way of giving you an example of how this topic, wellness and well-being and burnout, comes into our lives in every day. Many of us had the great pleasure of completing the ACGME survey. As you are aware, if you took this survey, as I did this past week, there are questions about burnout and well-being on the end of the survey. And I picked a couple of them to highlight what we're going to discuss. I find my work to be meaningful. I have enough time to think and reflect. And I find my work to be a positive challenge. And I don't know about everybody else out there, but I actually feel in my life right now that I am very positive. I find my work to be meaningful. I have time to think and reflect. And I find my work to be a positive challenge. But it wasn't always this way. But I do think this reflects the importance of what well-being is and how it can help all of us be happy and healthy in our lives and in our jobs. The other side of that coin, however, is that these days, wellness, burnout, resilience, depression, suicide, it's everywhere. We're seeing it on blog posts, we're seeing it in the lay press, we're seeing it in our inboxes, and it really can be somewhat depressing. Everybody knows the numbers. Burnout in emergency medicine is 65% or more. 28% of emergency physicians have thought about suicide at one point. And for the purposes of this talk, for the next 45 minutes, we're not going to focus on those numbers. We know it's out there. We know it's a problem. And to be honest, sometimes when my residents, when we talk to the residents about well-being or wellness, they say, honestly, talking about wellness makes me unwell. And I think there is a point to that. And the way that Lois and I wanted to structure this talk is to take a glass half full approach. There's no stopping the fact that there is a concern, there is a problem. but we're trying to take times in our lives when both of us felt depleted, when we felt unwell, and then use it as a strength to find positive change, to think about the ways that we can utilize our community of CORD members, of residents, of faculty, to try and make real positive change. The other way that I think about this is framing. And this is a concept that's well known, but essentially what it is that you can take any one thing. In this case, it's this apple. But you take this thing, and how it's presented to the audience influences the choices that people make about how they're going to process the information. So for the apple, for example, on the left, you see a broken, shattered, really jagged looking frame. And someone might say, ooh, that apple looks horrible. There's a bite taken out of it. I do not want to approach that. But on the right, it's the same apple, but the frame is sturdy and it's smooth and it's resilient. And that apple looks juicy and somebody already took a bite out of it, so it might be amazing. Take this for burnout. We could say burnout is this horrible problem. It's broken, medicine is broken, somebody has to fix it. It's not my problem, but it makes me really uncomfortable. Or we could say, there's this situation right now. People are burnt out, people are experiencing depression, but we're a group, we're a team. We are sturdy, we are strong, and we can tackle this together so that we can figure out some solutions. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to talk about ways to positively influence your resilience wherever you are, at home, if you're a resident, if you're a faculty. We really want to help.
Okay, so I think framing is really important, and we want to do that for the rest of this session, is to give you a frame, a direction of where we're going. And so I know we said we're talking about wellness, and we will, but I want to start at unwellness, because that has a framework for us already. And many may know my story of suicidality. I've been at suicidal crisis regarding my daughter when she had a malignant brain tumor and was devastated after surgery. And being the physician, I felt it was my failure of my daughter. And I traveled this suicide path. And as I've, over the last 3 years, become more involved with the suicide prevention community, there's a theory, Joyner's theory of suicide. And there's 3 factors that lead to suicidality: isolation, a sense of failure, and the capability to kill yourself. And if you have those 3 factors, that center area puts you in a high likelihood of crisis. When we look at medicine, particularly residency, we make the perfect storm. The residents come in, they're changed from their prior medical school experience, they don't have their friendships, they are new at becoming a physician and oftentimes have a feeling of failure. And there's no real way to get away from the capability. We have the knowledge and the means to kill ourselves. So what do you do about this? Well, I want to turn this on its head. I'll take the next slide, Megan. And I came up with this idea of having 3 other areas that correspond to those 3 factors. And if we focus on these, we may be able to move from an unwellness to wellness. Certainly it did for me. And where this came from for me was I was listening to the Are You OK podcast with Medutopia from June of this year, and Chris Doty was talking with Rob Rogers and was asked what we could do as individuals to be happier and more resilient. And I know nowadays with burnout, thinking about systemic changes is important. It's an important factor, but things that we have control over is our individual self. And so these 3 factors are individual things that you can do and own the ground beneath your feet and resilience. Chris used that word, it came from Sir Kandawal, that owning the ground beneath your feet of resilience and taking ownership of this is really important. So there's the 3 factors: connection, which goes against isolation, having a sense of purpose and calling. And the last one was really difficult for me in looking at what was the opposite of capability, and I went with compassion. Because You really can't take the knowledge and means away. But when I thought about it, the thing that gave me the capacity to consider that was the judgment against me, my own self-criticism of what I did wrong and what few other options I had besides suicide. And when you look at compassion, it gives you those other options. So now we'll go through each section. Back to you, Megan.
Okay. So Lois came up with an amazing shield. This is your shield to prevent against burnout and depression and to help you be resilient. And in order to highlight this, I'm going to talk about a story that really emphasizes the importance of connection in my own life. So residency was a lonely time for me, as it is for many of us. And this picture is actually taken from a Canadian Medical Journal article that was just recent that was entitled, "Medicine is One of the Loneliest Professions." And it depicts this resident. He's doing his work. He's in this lonely, dark hallway. And many of us feel that way. Although we're surrounded by people, we're lonely. We're doing our work, but we're not really communicating or connecting in meaningful ways. And that's part of the medical culture. And I fell victim to this. I was a second-year resident. I was working very hard, as all of us do. And I started having a series of things happen in my life. I had some bad outcomes. I feel like I missed some diagnoses. My roommate got married, so I was suddenly in this studio apartment all by myself. My parents and I were not really communicating at the time for a variety of reasons, and I had had a terrible breakup. And this is something that many of us have gone through. So I wasn't alone in that journey, but I was alone in my thoughts, and I started spiraling down into this self-deprecating mode, where every day I would say, you suck at this, you need to get better at this, you need to work harder at this. And then when I wouldn't have the energy or the drive or the desire to work harder, it would even get worse. And so I was just constantly having this negative self-talk, negative self-worth, and negative self-image. Even though I was actually going through the day-to-day work of residency, I was showing up, I was doing my thing, I felt horrible. And whereas in medical school, I felt like this, there was this beautiful sea of feeling great, and every now and then there'd be a surgical rotation or something that I'd have to get over, and maybe I didn't feel amazing. But in general, I was living in this sea of feeling great, and there were islands of feeling sort of bad. And that's what most people have. But when I was a second-year resident, it felt more like this. I was depressed and I didn't even know it. I was in this vast sea of feeling horrible. Horrible about myself, horrible about my choice to be a doctor, horrible about the future. I was in this sea of feeling terrible, and there was maybe an island of feeling good, way, way off in the distance, but I didn't feel that I could ever get there again. And as Lois was talking about with Joiner's theory, I felt isolated, I was alone, I felt like I was a burden to my colleagues. I didn't cut it, I wasn't good enough to be in the residency. And at one point, I started feeling that I wasn't afraid to die. I came home from a shift one day at 2:00 in the morning, and I got into my apartment and there was a man there. And soon I realized it was a burglar, and there was this few seconds of time that it was us in the middle of the night. And I thought, this is it. He's going to kill me, and it's going to be a relief. I felt like it was going to be a relief, a way out. And that started making me think, well, I could just bike into oncoming traffic. Because after that day that the burglar came, I got up the next morning and did what every resident would do. I went to work, and I bike commuted. I didn't have a car during those times, so I had this period of about 2 weeks where I was thinking about this every day, and I thought I could just do it. It would be so easy. And fortunately for me, one day I came to work, and I was coming on for the 9 a.m. shift, and the 7 a.m. was my chief resident, Kriti Bhatia. And she looked at me and she said, "Hey, Fixie, how are you doing?" And I had been crying, but I had brushed it off and went into the bathroom and got myself together. But she knew, and she connected with me without even saying anything. She paused and she looked in my eyes, and then she said, "No, really, how are you?" And I'll tell you guys, at that point, I had this amazing sense of relief. Not because I could hide from my emotions like I had been doing for all these times before, but because I couldn't hide any longer. Somebody who really cared about me connected with me and made me open up and made me realize that being vulnerable was actually being safe. I told her all of the things that had been going on. I cried, we connected, and believe it or not, I actually worked the rest of the shift. But at the end of the shift, she took me to have me call for the EAP. And Lois is going to talk more about EAP later, but I called the EAP, I got involved with counseling, and that led to a series of events that really helped me become who I am today. And I credit Krithi and the connection that we had and all the people who supported me during that time as changing my life, because I realized at that point that I wasn't really alone. Other people had similar thoughts, and the medical community actually supported me and rallied around me. And it had made me able to see myself differently, which we'll get to under compassion, and it made me a stronger, more resilient version of myself. But it started with connection. Okay, Lois.
Thanks, Megan. And I do think that one of the big points there is that double tap saying, how are you? No, really, how are you is an important thing to get to that second level. And that one-on-one part is so important. What I wanted to talk about, though, is some ways in our group, our faculty group, that we have tried to come together to help with the wellness, to decrease the loneliness. And as a nocturnist for 20 years, many of those hours single covered, I found that I had lost the connection with my colleagues. And so over the past year, we've developed some wellness activities. And here's some pictures of our group going out axe throwing, which I thought was the best thing. And I have another, next slide, Megan. We also went rock climbing. There's several other things. We're going to be going golfing. We've gone out to dinner. We've done painting with a twist. Not everything has been physically active. We've gone out to a bar, I think, for karaoke. And so there's things that you can do in your group to decrease this loneliness. Next slide. So now, this is my favorite part, the calling. I think that what we really need to remember is why we do what we do. The how and the what are there, but that sense of meaning, the purpose, what gives you energy is such an important thing. And our work can be hard. This can be stomped out of us, that calling is something that we have to remember and makes a huge amount of difference. So we're going to show a YouTube, hopefully here. And I want you to think about the why. This is a comedian, Michael Jr., and I just learned about this week. And he says, if you know your why, what becomes more impactful? Because you are walking in or towards your purpose. So I want you to watch these 2 minutes and see how his what changes to a why and what it does to everybody around him. Go ahead, Megan.
Okay.
Amazing, dude. So you're a musical director.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? We didn't plan this. Just so y'all know, we didn't plan this at all. I'm just randomly talking. Go ahead. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Wow. That bro could sing. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick. If you know which version I'm talking about, just see if that exists. Let me see what you got. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like
I think that really shows the how to sing, but then when you put the why, it can change everything. Not only the way he did Amazing Grace, but everyone around him. And he didn't do that all on his own. He could have done it the first time. The thing that I loved was the comedian gave him the opportunity, opened that path to give his passion, to show his skill. And for me, this is what teachers do. It gives the opportunity for someone to shine. And in chord, I would not have known 3 years ago that vulnerability and suicide prevention and all the stuff I've been doing over the last 3 years was going to be where I was going to be going. But chord gave me the opportunity in a number of ways, becoming part of the resilience committee, being able to speak down in Fort Lauderdale, having the National Physician Suicide Awareness Day. And it was because it's like, okay, show me what you got. And everybody around me in chord has been the ones that have supported me and congratulated me and gotten me to where I am. So for me, this calling and this purpose is really important. And I want to thank everybody in chord for all they've done for me. Go ahead, Meg.
And we would like to thank you, Lois, for all you have done for us. So I love that video too. It makes me like so excited every time I watch it because the why is so important. You can see that the words are the same, but the delivery is so much more meaningful and powerful and so much more energetic with the why behind it. And so for your resilience, to put in your toolkit under the calling, we want to talk about a way to think about yourself, what gives you energy, and what makes you feel passionate. And so for me, for example, when I was a medical student, I found that education and connecting with other students and doing teaching really gave me energy. It made me feel inspired. And so I've always tried to follow that sun, for example. And this is going to get into something that Chris Doty and Rob Rogers talked about in their podcast that Lois mentioned, the Are You Okay podcast. I highly recommend you guys check that out on Medutopia. But Chris has a really great concept where he talks about the classic Superman. The classic challenge is between the kryptonite, which drains him of energy and saps him and makes him a lump on the floor, right? But then Superman basks in the sun to recharge himself, to gain energy. And we want all of you to find that in your calling. And so it's going to be different for each of us. For me, my calling, as I mentioned earlier, is connecting. And I need to connect with my husband and my children, and actually with residents and medical students, because that fuels me. And so when I find that I'm being a little bit short with people or I don't feel like myself, I need to bathe in that sun, that calling, what makes me feel alive. I also need to make sure I'm fueling my physical body. So doing exercise, cooking and eating well, like that's something else that I really need for me. But if I'm not connecting, I'm not going to have that. And so with all of us, we want you to be able to tap into that balance. If you're having too much kryptonite in your life, you need to spend more time in the yellow sun. Your kryptonite's going to be there. All of us have it, so we need to learn to deal with it. But finding that tipping point where you need to recharge, where you need to find yourself energy, we really think that it comes from knowing what your why is, knowing what your meaning and purpose is, and that's going to be different for all of us. Along those lines, there's just another little tidbit that we wanted to point out. Career fit is also really important. And there's been some studies that looked at physicians. If they have less than 10 to 20% of their time doing what they care about, they're much more likely to be burned out. So again, Another reason to find your why, find what fuels you, and spend some time in the yellow sun. And then you all can be like Superman.
So now to compassion. These three things, the connection, the calling, and compassion, are something that individuals can do. This one was the hardest one for me. Coming from the pediatric brain tumor world, I connected with other parents. I felt like it was my calling to help them. But compassion, self-compassion, I could be compassionate for other people, but being compassionate for myself, I was having none of it. There was no self-compassion, no grace, no mercy, no forgiveness. And this has been the hardest area for me to figure out, that to really heal, to get on the wellness side, I needed that too. And it's been a slow journey over 3 years in learning these skills. Next slide. So I think my 2016 year was all about shame resilience theory. I wasn't planning to tell anybody about my suicidality until things happened. And I thought that being silent, not telling people, was what was keeping me free, what was letting me stay an emergency physician. And the very first thing I did was at Cord, 7 o'clock at Mockingbird 4 in Nashville. There was a memorial service, and in that, I said I had been suicidal. Well, if this is going to be a problem, might as well start it right out of the gate. And we came to the end of my story, and somebody said, I've never heard anybody in program leadership say anything like that. I'm like, I'm not in program leadership. To which it was like, I've never heard anybody in Accord say anything like this. And I was terrified. And with that, Megan came up to me and shared her story. And I found that once I spoke and Megan talked to me and told me her story and I wasn't alone, all of a sudden I felt like it was going to be okay. Okay, so it wasn't all of a sudden. I was good then, and 3.5 hours later, I had to track her down and talk again. And that empathy resonated with me, that if I talk about this, I can get better. Next slide. So then there was 2017, and I found another author, Shirzad Sharmain, who talked about positive intelligence and the survivor's brain versus this positive intelligent brain. And I was definitely in the survivor's brain. My emotions, anxiety, guilt, shame, regret, blame, they were all mine. And I didn't know how to deal with them. And so 2017 was one of the things. Next slide. And that's when I talked down in Fort Lauderdale. And we came to this slide, and I looked at my wellness right after my daughter was devastated by neurosurgery for her malignant brain tumor. I didn't know how to do this. Every part of my wellness was gone. I didn't do much about it for 16 years. I felt very guilty that how could I not have done anything to take care of myself? And I felt judgment against myself, and I felt judgment against everybody else, from everybody else, I'm sorry. And that's when, as we were going through the slides, Chris Doty stopped for what seemed like forever, and I was getting prepared for the next sentence. And in that, he said, I don't know what I would have done if it was my son. And all of a sudden, I realized that it might have just taken me a little longer, but none of us really knew what would happen. And the judgment I had to move away from that survivor, because we survived. We already survived. I didn't have to fight that anymore and move to this sage brain. So next slide. So this past year, I've learned more about self-compassion, and there's one person who really does this well, Kristin Neff, and she has developed 3 elements of self-compassion, because this is a big area: having self-kindness, a connection with humanity, and mindfulness. And on this site, you can test each one of those scales. And I was able to understand more of what was going on with my self-compassion. And L.A. Alvarez out of Stanford, there is a Center for Compassion, has really felt that this to be one of the big things that we should concentrate as we go forward in wellness. And I think that's true. So there's many aspects, and I hope that these 3 authors, Brene Brown, Shirzad Sharmain, and Kristin Neff, may be resources for each one of you. I know they've helped me.
And I agree with you completely, Lois. I had a really hard time with self-compassion too. And I would argue that probably many physicians have a similar feeling. We grew up in this culture of medicine where, as I was saying before, we really focus on our weaknesses. You suck at this, you need to get better at this, right? And so I think it's hard for us sometimes to just realize that we are all really wonderful human beings. And for me, in my journey, as I mentioned, I did counseling, but then I ended up going to a retreat in California for a week at the request of someone else who is one of my counselors. And she said, you know, Megan, the only person that you'll live with for your whole life is yourself. So you might as well love you. And that seems just like a crazy concept to me in this world of, you know, continuously jumping through all these hoops and taking tests and getting into residencies and doing things. So I went to this retreat called the Hoffman process, and there's many things like this out there, but this is the way that I learned it through this Hoffman process. They call it the quadrinity, and there's 4 aspects to every human being. There's your emotional self, your spiritual self, your intellect, and your physical body. And if any one of these is way out of whack, it will bring you down. And for me, I had a big fight between my emotional self and my intellect, where our emotional self is like your childlike, very innocent self, but it is also very creative. And it can be very easily irritated and put down and just feeling under the bus. And your intellect is the part of you that makes you a really good doctor. It's the part that makes you study and learn and push through and keep on going. But the intellect is also very judgmental. So the intellect can push down the emotional self. And then there's this kind of peacekeeper, the spiritual self, which is that beautiful version of yourself that is perfect. And I found to really rely on that part of me that had the insight, that was actually my gut level feeling. And I knew that I wasn't a horrible person, like I may have thought in my 2nd year of residency. So this is one of the models, and Lois mentioned 3 others, but we want all of you to find some way to harbor self-compassion for yourself so that you know that you are a safe place and that you can live with yourself forever, because you are the only person you will live with for your whole life. So getting back to our red shield. So we want to remind you, we've talked about 3 nouns: connection, calling, and compassion. Those are your armor against the depression and burnout that we all hear about. But now we're going to talk about some verbs along those lines that are things that you can actually do in your day-to-day life. So first off, Lois.
So counseling, talking to others, that connection is so important. And there's different ways you can do that. You can do that as individuals, you can do that formally, you can do it in groups. We want to talk about a couple of these things. Let's go to the next slide. The first one is EAP. I suspect all our residents or hospitals have the EAP option. And in the past, I think there was a negative connotation, maybe even still, that if you're being sent to EAP, you're in some way damaged or not right and need to go somewhere else to get fixed. And at our program, we're really trying to frame this a little differently, that the Employee Assistance Program is a benefit for all of us. And if we're not using this benefit, you're losing your benefit. And it's not just mental health. Mental health is one of the options, but it's a number of other things. Next slide. And at our place, there are a huge amount of different things, from aging parents, how you deal with being new parents, some financial, legal things, even dealing with pets. The number of services they have are huge. And I had looked at that. I even wrote about it with Amy Ondenko for the vocal cord, but I had never used it before up until this year. Last summer, I had come to the end of my rope of being a nocturnist, and I didn't know how I was going, after 2 decades, how I was going to change. And it really was not going well for me. And I have friends that I now talk to and often, and this actually got beyond that friendship, that I really needed to talk to somebody professionally. I'm like, well, might as well try the EAP. I've been talking about it. And ours has 6 sessions, and it made a huge difference. So if you haven't used EAP or have had people that it hasn't gone well, there are people that have had great help with it. And you can also look for a different counselor. It doesn't have to be the first person. It's definitely something to consider. Next slide. But the way that I handled this through brain tumor and through the first few years back into academics was with others. My friend David Edge in the Dominican Republic had a daughter 1 year ahead of my daughter on treatment. He was at the end and I was at the beginning, and he was the one who sort of shepherded me through. And on a particularly bad day, he told me about the cruise ships that came into La Romana to his resort where he worked. And he said, have you ever noticed that ships at the bottom have one color and the top have another? Like, yeah, whatever. I didn't know what he was trying to tell me. And he was trying to say that ships have this marking. It's not exactly that now. There is a symbol on the ships. But that basic concept, if you can't see that line, you can't see the difference, then that ship is overloaded, and you don't want it going out into open seas, because if there's a rough weather, if there's a storm, it's going to be easily capsized. So if a ship is above its Plimsoll Line, it has 2 things to keep it safe. 1, it can stay in a safe harbor, or 2, you get that crap that's overloading it overboard. And he told me he could be my safe harbor and unload stuff on him. And in my journey with my daughter on childhood cancer, he would be there for me. And that made a difference. And it made it easy when things were bad. I didn't have to do a whole lot of explanation. I could just say, I'm above my Plimsoll Line. And we knew exactly what the rest of the conversation would go, how much support I would need. So I think that's an important and useful concept.
And some people, as Lois mentioned, I think in medicine, again, we are somewhat reluctant to go for EAP or for counseling. And this brings up the idea of peer support. And when I was a resident, after I had gotten through the rough time, I met up with someone called Jo Shapiro, who's an expert, a national, international expert in this area. She's an ENT surgeon, and her concept was to create a group of peer supporters. And we actually did a study on this, and we surveyed a bunch of residents and attending physicians and asked them, if you had a bad outcome or you were feeling really down about something that was associated with your work, would you rather go to, and we listed a whole bunch of resources. And about 50% of the people would want to go to a counselor, but 88% wanted to talk to a peer first, another physician. And so Jo started this whole process of making peer support. And actually at the University of Utah, this slide is from our Resiliency Center. We, over the last year, have developed a peer support network and program as well. And our center would be happy to share this with any of you out there, but it's been a really great resource. And all the peer supporters like myself and other physicians are trained, and then essentially what you do is you listen. And listening is so powerful, and it's just what Lois was talking about, is helping other people ease their burdens. So peer support program is another way to give people in your group some support. Lois.
Okay, so now we're at the next circle to talk about calling. If you aren't feeling, change is the opposite, being associated with calling. And if you don't feel like you are meeting your purpose, you can't find that passion, you do have the option to change. It wasn't easy. Yeah, looking at this picture, this is sort of the way I felt, that I was in this desolation. There's nothing there, and trying to pull across the colors in my life. But I've looked at making changes at work, not being a nocturnist, becoming more academic, some things in my marriage, and that change has made the difference. Next slide. I just wanted to talk quickly about a story of change. When my daughter Tori was first diagnosed, she couldn't do much, so music was really important. And when we went to Florida, we would go to SeaWorld, and there was a dueling pianos there. And we would always ask for the same song, What a Wonderful World. It became our song. Flash forward to 2016, I went to the teaching course in New York City and went to a karaoke night. And I was like, okay, we have this whole loneliness thing. I'm going to go, even though I can't sing and I haven't done this before. When I got there, that's what song I was going to do. I didn't know. And this was the first thing that came across my mind. And as I was sitting waiting for my turn to come up, I'm like, this is not a good choice. I remembered everything about my daughter being bald when we were there, and I was worried about recurrence. And I thought I was going to become overwhelmed with those memories. As I sat there singing, between the first and second verse, there was a musical interlude. And I looked out and I saw these people that were part of the course, that were all with me and singing with me. And I realized that that wonderful world music from SeaWorld would never go away. I would always have that fear of what would happen in life. And I was trying to be fearless. But when I did that song in New York, it was like painting over the canvas and having a new meaning. And you can have the same thing and still have that same memory, but have it changed and repainted in a new direction in your life. Next slide.
And what we're talking about here is really not being afraid of change, engaging in change if you feel that that needs to happen to increase your resilience. One example that you can do in your group is what a friend of mine at Mass General recently went through. They had a faculty retreat, and 2 hours of that retreat time was spent on wellness. And it was led by Kimo Takiesu, who's written on burnout before. He's an expert in this area. And before the retreat, he emailed all the faculty and asked them, what would be great for our wellness? What would help you? And some people mentioned administrative help, money for scribes, shift time changes, etc. And then in that 2 hours, they sat down as a group and they voted on the 3 top things that really would enhance their wellness. And they did choose scribes and a sabbatical. And so the key thing here is that if you talk to your leadership and you decide that we're going to do something, you have to follow through. And it turns out that they actually did follow through, and all of these faculty members are going to have a 4-week sabbatical every 10 years that's paid. So whatever it is in your group, this is a good way to have small changes that might make a big impact in your group resilience.
So our last circle is to follow with the C's. congratulate. And when we think about what's happening in the emergency department in our lives, a lot of times we focus on that bad stuff, and you have to scroll down till you get to the good stuff. The bad stuff is like Velcro. Things stick in your mind. And the good stuff, it just sort of leaves. And I think if we intentionally remember the good things, to do 3 good things, the list of 3 good things every day, the more you do that and remember what's good in your life, the easier it is for that to come to mind. And I think we have to think of the thank yous, to thank other people, but also realize the number of thank yous we get in the emergency department. It seems that those bad interactions are the ones that stay in our mind. But if you actually start counting how many patients say thank you, it can happen a lot during a shift. And you're like, yeah. Okay, I got your blanket, or I gave you your discharge paperwork. It's just polite. But really, there are more thank yous in our work than we often consider. Next slide.
And really let those land. You earn those thank yous and let those land. One of the residents that Lois works with has a folder where he keeps all of the saves that he had and positive comments, or those rare times that you get a press gaming that was a positive comment or a handwritten thank you card. Save those and remind yourselves about those. Externally, in your group, you can also practice this positivity and congratulations. This can be doing a save case at the end of M&M, for example, to really celebrate and publicly thank somebody who saved a patient or came up with a great diagnosis. Give other people kudos and also give yourself. The other thing that we did in my group recently is we had a retreat where we did this thing called StrengthsFinder. It's a very well-known business kind of quiz thing that you can do where you answer a bunch of questions, and they have developed 34 inherent strengths in human beings. And we actually looked at all of them. All the people in our group have strengths. And we talked about how we can utilize each other's strengths. Some people are really good at strategy. Some people are really great at communication. Utilizing our strengths to make our group more resilient as a whole. And also, it can really make each other feel good. I contribute to the group because I have this. We all have strengths. And as opposed to medical culture where we say, again, you suck at this, you need to work at this, let's work towards our strengths and do the things that inherently we are really good at.
Lollipop moments. I love this concept. And this also came to my attention from Edutopia. There were 2 podcasts, one on August 31st and the other one October 30th, talking right about this concept. There's a guy, Drew Dudley, who has a story of how he influenced 2 people's lives early in college by through a lollipop. We don't have time to play that YouTube, but it's worth looking at the video. And the thing is, he had given a lollipop and suggested that the man they gave it to give it to the woman beside him standing in line. And 4 years later, they were still together. And they had never talked after that. I think that the impact of people, what you do with people, the interactions, you may never know how it changes their life, but it can make a huge difference, one little interaction. And he was lucky that he found out from the woman in the story 4 years later that they were still together. And then that couple got married. And it was because of a lollipop, a simple little thing that brought that connection between the couple that made the difference. And all of us have lollipop moments, things that they do, little things that may alter the course of a person's life. And if you get the chance to know what they are, it's awesome. And if you've had those moments and haven't told people, I think it's important that you do, because those thank yous, those times of congratulating people for the way they've changed your life makes a difference.
So in summary, we think that all of you matter and you matter to each other. And this is the red shield that Lois came up with, just to reiterate the concepts that we've talked about in the themes. So this is your shield against burnout and depression and suicide. It involves connection with others, making sure that you know your calling, you know the why, and you're getting yourself time in your yellow sun, having compassion for yourself, seeking out counseling, either with people that you know, EAP, somebody that you can talk to relieve some of those burdens. Not being afraid of change and changing so that you are in alignment with your calling. And finally, congratulating yourself and others for all of the lollipop moments that you are giving to somebody else and for the other people around you who are doing great things.
So Megan and I have had a great time putting this together. We feel very passionate about these issues. I hope you've enjoyed this and would like to open it up to questions.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so very much to our speakers, Dr. Megan Fix and Dr. Lois Swisher. We would like to open it up to the audience now for questions. There are two ways you can ask questions. One, if you hover over the slides on your computer, on the bottom, on the bottom left, you have this option that says unmute. If you unmute yourself, you can ask a question. Or if you prefer, you can type a question. Also, by hovering over the slides, on the bottom, you will have an option that says chat. And if you click on chat, there'll be a box that opens that says type message here. Feel free to utilize either one of those options to ask your question. Feel free to go ahead. Okay, so while we're waiting for everyone else, I'm going to pose a question. So if you are a new chair or a new director of a department and you want to build a wellness curriculum or a wellness process for your department, what are the top 2, maybe 3 ingredients that you would recommend?
That's a great question, Moshe. There are many ingredients. I think there's actually a lot of literature that can help you with this as well. We didn't have time to go over it in the podcast, but if anybody wants, there are some papers that really talk about a systems-wide approach to making wellness better and making big change. And the big people to read are Tate Shanafelt is one of the lead authors on many of these papers. So I think trying to get a sense for what's out there, what the problem is. But I do think that polling your group is really, really important, and polling them in a way that they don't feel that they're judged. So for example, getting an anonymous list of things that would increase their wellness, because it may be that the work environment really needs to have dictation service or something, who knows, right? But I think there are simple things that you can do to make systems-wide changes. And then I really feel that connecting with each person on an individual level is also super important. Lois?
Yeah, I agree with that, connecting with people on an individual level. I have a personal story of having a new chair 4 years ago. And we knew each other before, wasn't sure how the relationship would be. And immediately after the announcement, I went to talk with him. And he said, your citizen requirement, pretty weak. And I said, I agree. He goes, well, what do you want to do? I'm like, I want to do GME. Nobody had ever asked me that before. He goes, come back with some thoughts about what you want to do. And the rest is history. Being asked what my passion was and opening that up was really important. I think that connection, asking people what they want to do and trying to connect a little bit of that can make a big change in how they see themselves at work.
Great, thank you both so much. Dr. Doty, I think that means your hand is up if I am reading this system correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, I was muted, sorry. I just had I really appreciate you guys talking about this stuff. I think it's super important to our continued success within the council, and also, as clinicians, and I really appreciate you guys being out front on it. Why do you think the self-compassion thing is so hard? That seems to be such a common issue in medicine.
Well, I think that one of the reasons that we are physicians makes it hard to have self-compassion because we're all pretty driven in some way, right? I mean, to get through medical school and all of the training and residency, you do need to have some degree of putting yourself to the line and just making yourself work through all these hoops. And I think self-compassion is actually counter to that, where you take a step back and reflect and you actually allow yourself to rest and relax and really congratulate who you are. I don't think that's true for everybody, but I think that is one of the things that makes us good at what we do, but also makes it hard to really just rest and be okay with who we are. What do you think, Lois?
I think that for me, and I have had a very high level of judgment, that it was personally equated with being able to succeed. To have that high bar made me push myself further, and by not having that feeling of high judgment, then maybe I wouldn't strive as far as, I wouldn't shoot as high. And that fear of being too easy on myself and then not succeeding, I think led to a cycle that to succeed, I had to have that judgment. If you didn't have that judgment, you wouldn't succeed. And I didn't know how to get out of that circle. I'm still working on that. But I think that realizing that I can have the drive without having the judgment was a life-changing thing. Like you can still work really hard and not feel like you're going to fail every single moment. It's been hard for me. I don't have a good answer.
I will say one thing though, I think my experience of life with self-compassion is so much more rich and meaningful. And it's difficult to explain, but I think before I found self-compassion, I was going through motions, I was running on the treadmill, I was getting everything done, checking off all the boxes. But now that I have self-compassion, I actually feel like I'm more productive, I'm more connected, I'm a more like essential human being because I'm not as driven. So I think it's a super important piece of what we're trying to get across here with these themes. And I hope everybody can allow themselves the time and the space to find it for each of them.
Great, thank you. Dr. Doty, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm going to say thank you.
Okay, so we have another question from Dr. David Marcus, and his question goes as follows. It says, what do you think of the critique of burnout and well-being issues as being the domain of younger millennial physicians? Were these issues just hidden in the past, or were previous generations protected? Were the stressors not there?
That's a really good question, and I don't think we have time for the answer. But I do think the things that we're dealing with were there then. I don't think we were as focused on them. I don't think we really asked the question. I don't think we surveyed people probably as much as we do now. But I do think the millennial generation also offers us a lot of creative solutions to the problem.
Okay.
I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? Feel free to either unmute your phone/computer or type a message in the chat section. Okay, well, on that note, I would like to again thank our speakers, Dr. Megan Fix and Dr. Lois Swisher. Thank you all for joining us today. Our next court session will be on February 28th. Looking forward to seeing you there. And just want to remind everyone that these sessions are recorded and they are available on the court website if you would like to take a listen again or review a certain part or if you missed something. And all the other Court Connect sessions are there as well. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moshe. Have a great day to you too.
Thanks.